Hello everyone. Today we're going to be learning about Java AWT. Under Java AWT, we're going to be looking at the following topics, which is components. And under components, we are going to be specifically looking at checkbox and drop-down list, which is also called choice. Next, we are going to be looking at events, event sources, event listeners, and event handling. AWT stands for Abstract Window Toolkit, and it is Java's platform independent graphics and user interface toolkit. It will provide the user with a collection of components like buttons, labels, text fields, checkboxes, radio buttons, etc., which can be used to create graphical user interfaces. So AWT actually provides the users with components which are visual elements of a UI, and these components can respond to user input like mouse clicks or keyboard actions. AWT is part of Java Standard Library, and it relies on the native GUI of the OS to render components, making it a heavyweight toolkit. What this means is that AWT depends on the OS of the system to render its components. So the components which are being rendered can differ from OS to OS. For example, a Windows system might have different looking components as compared to a Linux OS. Now, AWT supports event based programming, meaning it responds to user actions like clicks and keystrokes through event handling mechanisms. The components are the visual elements of the user interface that users interact with. So each component will represent a specific piece of the UI and can respond to user input like mouse clicks or keyboard actions. So components are actual visual elements which you see on a GUI or on an application. So the below are a few examples of commonly used components. So you have examples of a button, a label, text field, checkbox, and choice. So these are some of the most commonly used components. Now we will be looking at checkbox and choice in more depth. A checkbox is a graphical component that can either be in an on state or an off state, which is either a true state or a false state. So clicking on a checkbox can either change the state from on to off or from off to on. So a checkbox is represented by the checkbox class, and it allows users to make a binary choice. So a user can either have one option on or multiple options on. The difference between a checkbox and a radio button is radio button allows for only one choice, whereas checkbox allows for multiple choices. So this is a small example or the small pseudocode of how checkbox works. So first you have the first imports, which is java.awt and java.awt.event. Then you have a checkbox class with a variable which is creating a new checkbox. So this is the checkbox object through which you are creating a checkbox. So now we can look at the actual code implementation. So here, like I said, you have the imports, which is java.awt. Here we are just creating a small frame to add our checkboxes in. Here we're going to create two objects of checkbox, which is checkbox C++ and checkbox Java. And here we're going to add the checkboxes to the frame. And upon execution, it will look like this. So this is how your checkbox will look like. So you can either click on one or both the checkbox at the same time. So this is an on state and this is an off state. So the next component we are looking at is a choice, also called a drop down list. So this is often represented by the choice class in AWT. It allows users to select one option from a list of available choices. So what that means is you will have a huge list of choices and the user can pick any one of these choices. So from the example, we can see that multiple languages are given here like C, C++, Java, etc. And a user can select any one of these languages from the list. So this is a pseudocode of a choice. So you have import java.awt and then .event, and then this is the actual object creation, which is choice variable name is equal to new choice. Upon doing this, we will be creating an object for a drop down list. So now let's look at an actual implementation of the code. So this is the code for a choice. So you have import Java. These are the imports which are needed to create the object, and then we are creating a new frame. Into this we are going to be adding all our components. So this is the creation of a choice. So you have choice, which is a class name, and then a variable is equal to a new choice. So now this itself is the component or creation. And after this, we are going to be using the dot add method to add items into this. So you have dot add C, dot add C++, dot add Java, etc. Like this, you have multiple items which you can add. So let's execute this program once. So upon execution, this is what your output will look like. So you have select a language, and when you click on this button, a drop down list will show up. So you have C, C++, Java, PHP, etc. And a user can select any one of these objects or items. So for example, if I select Java, if I click on it, you can see Java over here. If I want PHP, I can click on PHP and that will be selected. So a user is able to select any one option from a large list of options. So next topic we are going to be looking at is event. So events are actions which are triggered by user interactions with GUI components like clicks, selection, or key presses. So what this means is whenever a user does any action like clicking a mouse button or clicking a keyboard button, it will generate a event. So AWT uses an event-based model which will respond to user actions through event handling. And events will enable applications to react dynamically to user input, enhancing interactivity. So essentially, events are just the actions which are done by users, which can be used to respond to the user. So event sources. The component that generates an event, such as a button, checkbox, or dropdowns, are called event sources. So any component that is generating an event is an event source. So now clicking on a button like this click me button, if you click on it, the button becomes the event source and the mouse button click becomes the event. The same with the checkbox. These two components are the event sources, C++ and Java. Now, turning on the state of one of these checkboxes will become the event, and the checkbox itself becomes the event source. So, here a button triggers an event when clicked, and then a checkbox triggers an event when its state changes. So, now the event sources will identify where the event originated, allowing listeners to respond appropriately. This means that the event sources will let the listeners know where the event is being generated so it can be handled properly. So, event listener, an interface that listens for and handles events generated by event sources, enabling responsive interactions in GUI applications are called event listeners. What this means is an event listener is basically an interface which will listen for events, and when such events are triggered, it will respond to these events by executing whatever specific code has been given to it. So, event listeners also differ from event to event. So, for example, you have action listener, and this is used for button clicks. You have item listener, which is used when checkboxes or drop-down selections are done. You have mouse listener, which is used to handle any kind of mouse-related action. You have window listeners, which will manage window events like opening a window, closing a window, or minimizing a window. Now, each of these listeners will have a specific method for implementation, which means each of this listener will have their own kind of method. And one example is an action listener. So the method used here is action performed with the parameters being action event of E, and this E is a variable. Event handling is the mechanism through which an application responds to user interactions with GUI components. What this means is event handling is basically the mechanism through which now if a user is interacting with a component, the component will trigger an event listener which will listen to the event and execute some kind of code. Now, the entire process of that happening is called event handling. So, here the components involved in event handling are event sources, which are the components that generate the event, and event listeners, which are the interfaces that listen for events and will define how to handle them or how like what kind of code to execute. So the process goes like this. So you have a user interaction. So a user interaction with the GUI component, like clicking a button or entering some text in a text box, etc. And event generation. So once a user is interacting with the GUI component, that component will generate some kind of event, like an action event for a button click. The third step is event dispatching. This means the event is dispatched to the appropriate event listener. So whatever event is taking place, so that event is being sent to the appropriate event listener method. And the last step is event handling. The listener will execute the defined code to respond to the event. So now upon clicking a button, a certain code has to be executed. So whenever a listener will execute that code in response to the user interaction, the entire process is called as event handling. So this is a small code which demonstrates the entire event handling mechanism. Here we have our regular imports, and we are creating a new frame to add our components inside. Here we are creating a new button with the object name of button, and here we're going to be adding a method to this button called add action listener, and this is a predefined method which will have parameters of new action listener. Now this action listener is an interface which will let the compiler know that this button is now an event listener. So this button is now an event listener, and it will look for any kind of event so that it can handle it. So inside this, we are creating a new method called action performed with the parameters of an action event key. And since AWT is an API, this is just an abstracted version, so you don't have to worry about this part. So this method is simply going to print out the message button clicked to the terminal. So let's execute this once. So after executing, you're gonna get a small window here which has a button which says click me. Now when you click on this button, you can see in terminal we have the statement which we wrote here being printed out, which is button clicked. So here the button is the event source. This part is the event listener, which is this method, and the button click is the actual event. So this is the entire mechanism of event handling. So from the user clicking the button and the button performing whatever code it's being set to perform.